beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. In this video we'll be looking at the truth behind the original gravity and final gravity numbers from a recipe during the beer brewing and fermentation process. I believe that when you find out the actual reality here, then it could totally change the way you view things. In my usual style, I'm going to be very to the point and stick to the facts about this to not waste your time or mine, so let's get started. In modern homebrewing, many out there, including myself, like to be as accurate in their brewing as possible. I am a constant recipe writer and regularly share my recipes and share the vital statistics which include original gravity and final gravity numbers. But just how accurate are these numbers? I will now cover the details. Personally, I generate these gravity numbers via software, but it has to be said that if I was to enter the exact same recipe into each and every brewing software platform, then, quite frankly, there will be a swing on the OG and FG numbers. This is due to the simple fact that each of the software packages available use slightly different ways to crunch this data to predict estimations, and also the data they may have could well vary when it comes to the ingredients used. However, it should be realised that the numbers generated are simply estimates. Do be aware that this applies to you even if you are not coming into contact with brewing software and are, for example, brewing with all grain kits, because the OG and FG numbers would have been calculated somehow with formulas via either a spreadsheet method or by software anyway. Naturally, our ingredients play a large role in how our gravity will be affected, so let's look into this too. The malted grain that we use for brewing will have a yield figure that is updated by the respective maltster after each harvest. This number is used for our gravity predictions via software alongside other data. You can check this via your brewing software in the way that I'm showing on screen. They're all fairly similar in this respect. The common method to use to generate these numbers is to take samples of the malts and then analyse them. As you can imagine, seeing as barley is simply grown in the ground, not all of the finished malt has the same level of yield or other relative statistics, so due to this variation, averages are found and reported. What is not known by the beer brewing industry nor the homebrew industry either is just how large this variation is per batch from each of the many maltsters out there in the world. So even when this grain is fresh from harvest, there is already some variation. Depending on how the grain is stored since then can also have an effect. This works down the chain from distributor to brewery or from distributor to homebrew store and then to the brewer, and will determine how close the yield will be to this original figure when it gets brewed with, because having the wrong storage conditions will certainly reduce that yield further. Sometimes this can be simply due to a problem like a freakishly hot summer, but you can understand that in some cases this grain is still going to be sold. You have no way of knowing until you brew with it. It should also be mentioned that if you are brewing with wheat, then you expect an even further variation no matter what, due to the simple fact that wheat is primarily grown for the cereals industry, and unlike barley there are no breeding programs for it, with beer brewing in mind. So the next time you brew a wheat beer with a grain bill that is 50 to 70% wheat, then certainly you should not be surprised if you see a variation in the original gravity from prediction. Naturally, when it comes to final gravity, your yeast plays a very important role. Any given yeast will have an attenuation rate applied to it. This is quite simply the percentage of sugars that we expect the yeast to eat during fermentation. This percentage is often shown by yeast companies as a percentage range on their websites, as you can see here. The reason for this is that depending on the composition of your fermentables, the attenuation rate will be subject to variation. The composition of beer malt can be made up of 5 different types of sugar as well as starches and dextrins, all at varying percentages. There are other factors too, like for example diastatic power, which is about the amount of enzymes of conversion, which will also govern how fermentable your malt is. Hence why yeast companies generally provide a percentage range for attenuation. However, moving against this, recipe prediction requires a single number, and this is usually an average. Within my shared recipes, I will often change the attenuation rate percentage based on my experiences to narrow down some accuracy here, but naturally there are still other factors that cannot always be controlled. One of these, as we have already discussed, is the variation of yield found in our grain bill, but it should also be understood that our mash is key to attenuation alongside yeast. So for example, if your grain crush was off, then this can also have a dramatic effect on your FG. In fact, what happens during your mash is the single most important factor when it comes to the brew. There is some final advice. If you are keen to narrow things down, then it really is about consistency to start with. This way you can repeat your results. Also, brewing small test batches that can be used to plot your recipe's brewing and fermentation numbers can also be very productive in nailing down a full batch to a more accurate level. But it has to be said and understood that, when it comes to beer brewing and also fermentation, we should expect some variation, even when we do all we can to narrow things down. I believe that the very best attitude to have around this is to actually embrace the variation. It is very much a part of brewing, as this is quite simply not a direct science in actual fact, despite how much some would really want it to be. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!